Hey, this is Todd. We want to welcome you to Food Trucks in Babylon. Nice.
Oh, this is going to be fun.
Nice.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, all right.
Good to go.
In our culture, there's an increasing crisis of truth and crisis of knowing. You could call it an epistemological crisis, to use a big philosophical word. And it has to do with, fake news and post-truth and conspiracy theories and just the nature of the internet, where there's so much information to wade through that we don't have the ability to sift through it all and to understand what is true and false.
You are listening to Food Trucks in Babylon, a Western Seminary podcast. We're here with Ryan Lister. I'm Todd Miles, and today our guest is Brett McCracken, author of books such as Uncomfortable, Hipster Christianity, and Gray Matters. He's also senior editor and now the director of communications for the Gospel Coalition. Today we want to dive into his new book, The Wisdom Pyramid, with the subtitle Feeding Your Soul in a Post-Truth World. Now, this book is, in a way, a guide through the fog and confusion of our world. So if you felt overwhelmed by your news and Twitter feeds, or you just don't know which way is up, then join us as Brett helps us diagnose what's making us sick in our post-Christian world and to help us back to the health found in biblical wisdom.
If you could sort of summarize yourself by just like filling out who and what you do on a business card, how would you do that?
Well, thank you for having me. I think in terms of like Twitter bios when I get this question. So I think I say something like author, editor, film critic, cultural commentator, husband, pastor, father. So that pretty much sums it up.
That's a really long business card.
That is.
So yeah, we'll give you several business cards for that.
I think my Twitter profile also says aging millennial. So
very good. Yes,
that
aging hipster from
age.
Hipster Christianity.
Maybe aging hipster, post-hipster, whatever, maybe.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, I want to ask you just a couple of follow-ups out of that. I mean, you're sort of guiding the arts and culture section of the Gospel Coalition.
Yes.
So could you just help us think through, just off the top, what is culture? How would you define that for us, especially all those out here in the Pacific Northwest who are engaging those type of issues relatively consistently?
Yeah, I mean, what is culture? That's a big question. I mean, I think Ken Myers defined it as what we make of the world in both senses. So, both creating culture, it's something we can create, but it's also interpretation. It's what we make of the world. It's how we, it's the humanities, it's philosophy, literature, So that would be kind of my succinct definition of culture. Although I do get wary of people, talking about the culture, which evangelicals are prone to do. So it's good. It's good to get down into definitions. But in terms of my work at the Gospel Coalition, I basically oversee any content related to the arts and culture. So that's everything from film reviews, TV, engaging anything in pop culture to technology, cultural trends, that sort of thing.
That's good.
Yeah.
So if push down a little bit further, what would you say is the biggest issue that's defining our culture or trend setting our culture today?
Wow. I mean, I think that there's just a little bit of an anti-culture tendency in our culture. It's a very deconstructive posture towards culture. So if I were to boil down a lot of problems to one, I think it would be that. It seems like we're in a moment that is less about constructive creating. It's less about the good, true, and beautiful as it is about the critical. And even the best films that are being made, even the best art that is being made, so much of it, I think, is coming from that anti-culture, kind of iconoclastic posture. There can be some good things to that, but I think by and large it's not great. And
Yeah. Where would you say the source of that's coming from? That trend towards deconstruction?
I mean, it's been brewing culturally and philosophically for a long time. I think Carl Trueman's new book is a good one to chart that trajectory in a lot lot of arenas, gender but
Rise of the Modern Self, I think is the name of that. Or?
Yeah, the rise and the triumph of the modern self.
Right.
I think
I
it's
forgot
called.
the triumph.
It's a long book, but
Carl.
it's worth reading. So yeah, there's a long history of this move, I think, to a more like deconstructivist. It's really, I guess, the latter part of the 20th century is when it accelerated, and postmodernity and whatnot. So yeah, I don't know what I mean. I have some theories related to technology and how that's reshaping things that contribute to this very kind of deconstructionist posture. But yeah, it could be a long answer to get into all that.
Yeah, well, we'll follow that hopefully through your new project
I think
here.
So, yeah.
I think that'd be a fun thing to sort of walk through. Before we get there, though, I do want to ask, what is Christianity's place in the culture? Especially that sort of that deconstruction. Like, how do we? I would say most of our pastors. Now, I don't want to go too far. They may be aware of it, but trying to navigate that. How does Christianity fit into the culture? Does it fit into the culture? That kind of
right. Yeah, I mean, man, Christianity and culture is a relationship that is very complex and fraught with all sorts of theories. And Niebuhr, right, had his various taxonomies of different relationships: Christ above culture, against culture. And so I tend to think that the healthiest approach for the church to take towards culture needs to be kind of both and, like multi-front. So I think there's times when we need to be definitely against the culture where we need to be, and there needs to be a clear kind of demarcation. And yet there's times where we should be, if not celebrating the culture, then at least engaging it and able to point out the good and the true and the beautiful in culture where it exists in a common grace type sense. Yeah. I think the challenge with this whole conversation of Christianity and culture is people tend to fall into one of the camps, and at various points in Christian history, and maybe even the last like 50 years, there's been times where evangelical Christians, to take one subset, have been by and large more of the kind of against the culture, like skeptical of the culture. Right. But then of late, in the last few decades, and I talk about this in my book Hipster Christianity, there was kind of a reaction against that anti-culture posture, with a lot of younger Christians wanting to have a much more charitable, accepting, engaging posture towards the culture. And but that, going too far on the other extreme has also brought a lot of problems, because when you get too undiscerning in that, it's very easy to be colonized by that culture. John Mark Comer has talked about that in his podcast. So yeah, I mean, I think we just have to be able to have a complicated relationship with culture as Christians. It's not an easy one size fits all approach. So that's part of what I love doing at the Gospel Coalition in my work. On any given month at the Gospel Coalition, I might have one article that feels like something a fundamentalist would have written for like Focus on the Family 20 years ago. Yeah. Because I'm so mad about the falsehood that a piece of pop culture is promoting, and I'm very clear that Christians need to, denounce it. But the next week, I might write a favorable review of an R-rated film that contains a lot of truth that I think Christians should wrestle with, and I'm labeled, a liberal, progressive, for that. So that's what I'm saying. When it's a complicated relationship, I think there's going to be moments where you need to kind of be accused of being a fundamentalist, and there might be moments where you're accused of being a libertine.
Well, the reason we were excited to have you in today, kind of is a response to what you'd said earlier about navigating the culture. It takes wisdom. There's nothing cookbook about it.
Yeah.
And so your latest book is The Wisdom Pyramid, subtitled Feeding Your Soul in a Post-Truth World. Why this book? Why now?
Yeah, well, I think that in the last few years, I've just noticed in our culture there's an increasing crisis of truth and crisis of knowing. You could call it an epistemological crisis, to use a big philosophical. And it has to do with fake news and post-truth and conspiracy theories and just the nature of the internet, where there's so much information to wade through that we don't have the ability to sift through it all and to understand what is true and false. And so the ground is crumbling beneath our feet, and the results are just tragic. And I think part of why I wrote this book is just pastorally. I became an elder in 2016, so I'm more attuned to how people are shaped by this landscape in the media and by a diet that is not conducive to wisdom and that's actually shaping people in the direction of foolishness. And I've seen it in my own life as someone who spends a lot of time online. I think being a full-time editor at a website, right, living in that world of the internet and social media, that's probably also fed into why I wrote The Wisdom Pyramid when I did, because I see every day firsthand just how fraught the internet landscape is with landmines of every sort. And how hard it is to be wise in today's day and age. It's not easy, and I see it in my own instincts to like grab my phone pretty much right when I wake up, without even knowing why, and looking at it when I'm sitting at a stoplight and not even knowing why, and when I'm in line at a coffee shop and there's literally 30 seconds of free time. What do we do? Like
heads go down.
Heads go down, and swiping begins. And so that problematic kind of conditioning that's happening, man, it's just troubling to me. So I wanted to write a book that makes people aware. I think just kind of even the graphic alone, when people see it, people have this instinctive reaction like, oh man, like this is a gut check, like because we all, I think, intuitively know we flipped the pyramid and we're feeding our souls with a diet that's quite out of whack to what it should be if we want to be wise. So it's really just a book that guides people back to better sources that are conducive to wisdom. Yeah.
Now that diagram that you're speaking of is kind of a retake on the nutritional diagram,
the food
pyramid, the food pyramid that we saw.
Yep.
That changes so much over the years.
It has, gluten is no longer the base layer.
That's
in the
right.
Gluten-free age.
That's right. Probably many, even before they've seen the book, have seen the wisdom pyramid diagram, because it's basically turned into a meme at this point and being shared by people. Our pastor at one point shared it from a sermon.
Oh, cool.
That's big time, because there's not a lot of sharing of visuals.
It was not a visual.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Do not think we actually have visuals
gotcha.
at Ensign Church. No, it is a word-based ministry for sure. Basically, with the nutritional pyramid foundation, and then you work your way up. At the top of the pyramid is not the most important thing, but maybe something you should have less of.
Yep.
Your take on the wisdom pyramid, the diagram looks like the foundation is
the Bible.
Yeah,
and we can at some point maybe go through each layer. But I mean the idea is taken from the food pyramid, like a visual aid to help people understand the most healthy to the least healthy food groups, if you will, or knowledge groups. And so in the place of fats, oils, and sweets, which was at the top of the wisdom or the food pyramid, in the kind of use sparingly slot, I put the internet and social media, and I think that's the one that people are like, oh yeah, about that.
Yeah, that's
like,
that's my base.
That's
right
my
now.
base.
That's my base.
Uh-huh. So yeah.
Yeah, I have a feeling that your wisdom pyramid is going to have a little more staying power than the nutritional pyramids.
Oh, really?
The food
Okay.
pyramids. Well, I mean, those change.
Yeah.
Those change all the time.
Yeah.
I don't see yours changing.
Well, I
honestly.
hope not. I mean, that was my goal with this book more than probably any of my other books, is like, I want it to be relevant 20 years from now.
Right.
And, even as the world changes, what is conducive to wisdom shouldn't change that much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. So, I mean, connected to that, I mean, as I was reading it, I saw quotes, but heard echoes of Neil Postman.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
How much did that influence you? And,
Yep.
Amusing ourselves to death.
Yeah, amusing ourselves to death with his
Yes.
back.
1980.
Yeah, I think it was
85,
85.
I
Yeah.
think.
So an older treatise, but a lot of stuff coming through here. Do you see the connections there? Were you working towards that end, or?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Neil Postman is probably like among the top 5 like authors that have formed me intellectually.
Okay.
Like,
Who are the others?
oh man,
I'm sorry to do that to you. I know C.S. Lewis.
C.S.
a great
Lewis,
question.
definitely. Yeah, I mean, I have to come back to you on that.
Okay, you can.
Well, okay.
I like
Ryan
that.
Lister. Who else?
Well, yeah,
Who
just
else?
Right.
we'll scratch that one.
Yeah.
out of the
Okay.
way.
So yeah, Neil Postman.
Marilyn Robinson.
Marilyn Robinson could be
Okay.
up there for me. Yeah. I actually. So yeah, with Neil Postman, kind of backstory on that. I went to Wheaton College and I was a media studies kind of major.
Okay.
And I had a professor named E.J. Park he was a comm professor at Wheaton, but he had studied under Neil Postman at New York University.
Okay.
So he was kind of a one step removed guru in like media ecology. And so I was really, he was a really formative professor for me at Wheaton. And so, yeah, Neil Postman and just that kind of critical prophetic posture towards technology is something that has really shaped how I look at it. So I've always been a little bit of a Luddite, late adopter with social media. And sadly, now it's my world because I'm a digital editor.
Yeah.
And I'm on social media all the time. But I think the best way to practice social media is as a skeptic and as a critic, and to be really aware of the pitfalls. And so that was definitely in the background as I wrote the Wisdom Pyramid. Is this is our world, for better or worse. We live in a digital world, but if we're going to live well in this world, we need to have a certain degree of critical distance and prophetic critique towards it.
Oh, that's good. So, where did the initial idea for this come from? And yeah,
You're setting yourself up for
I am. That's all I'm doing. This is really,
humble beast plug here.
that's right. Yes.
And now a word from our sponsors.
Right.
Humble bees. Yes.
Yeah, it was at the Canvas conference that Humble Beast put on with Western in 2017. So you had asked me to speak on, I think the prompt was true joy in a fake news world. And in the course of like preparing my talk for that topic, I just, something inspired me to like go create this like food pyramid type.
Were you on a diet
graphic.
at the time? Were you thinking?
No, I don't know. I think I was just like,
You just love the food pyramid. You're always.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. It came from somewhere, and it was really just because what I was trying to get at in my talk was that the habits of intake are critical. Like if we're gonna have any hope of surviving in an epistemological crisis, it really boils down to discernment in terms of where we're looking, what those sources are. So I was thinking, how can I visualize that, right? How can I show people what like trustworthy sources are in a fake news world? So I had a designer friend of mine, a graphic designer, create the Wisdom Pyramid. I drew it out like on a napkin or something, and I was like, could you just make this look pretty? And he did, and that was it. And so it was just kind of like a slide on during my presentation at that conference, but then I posted it on social media, ironically, after.
Yes, and I think everybody else at the conference posted it too.
Yeah, people were taking photos of it on their phone.
It went viral.
It did. It kind of took on a life of its own. So, yeah, that was the origin of the Wisdom Pyramid.
That's good. How was this? You talked about it already a little bit, but how is this personal to you? Like this isn't just something you feel that as you read the book. This isn't just something that's I need to tell you out there about this. This is something personal. So
right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's what I was already saying about just in my own life, kind of living in this world and feeling the sickness, like feeling the like physical, like dizzying effects of the digital age. Like when when you open social media and 5 minutes of scrolling on Twitter, you're like feeling sick to your stomach, or like the constant feeling going through your day, like with all the pings and push notifications, just feeling like you're on a hamster wheel and never catching up. And I mean, I talk about this in the book, but like there's all sorts of rising rates of mental illness and anxiety and depression and all of that. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the spikes on those charts really did start getting steeper around like 2007, 2008, when the smartphone was introduced, the iPhone. So I don't think that's the only kind of correlative like cause, but it's a big one, and we can't ignore it. And so that's been personal to me, just seeing in my own life and kind of swatting my hand when it goes to grab the phone first thing in the morning. And then also just becoming a dad, I think personally, like I became a dad 2 years ago. My son Chet is 2. And when you become a parent, I think you view the world in a different way, and you start to like worry about like the world that they're entering and how you can disciple them. And the media landscape that is there for the exploring through devices is so scary when you think about your kids and what they have access to at their fingertips. So I think that was probably one of the personal reasons I wanted to write the book, just for my kids and for their generation. Yeah.
Who's your audience here? Or are you talking to? And this is going back even what you're talking about out of your work at TGC. Are you talking to conservatives? Are you talking to progressives? I mean, are you talking to both? How's this working? Is it the church? Is it the world?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think I do think it's a book that everyone could benefit from, because we're all in this world and we're all in this situation of cultural sickness and epistemological crisis. It is probably more geared towards Christians because the base layer of my pyramid is the Bible. So unless you're a very open-minded non-believer, which I would hope that some non-believers would read it and would start to think twice about like, well, maybe there's something there about the Bible and truth in a post-truth world. But yeah, I probably am gearing this towards Christians and in a little bit of a like call to be more careful and discerning, lest we lose our saltiness by being compromised by this environment, which I see every day. I see every pastor in 2020, I think, has seen very dramatically how life online forms you and is forming people in very problematic directions. And it's kind of like, Jamie Smith talks about like cultural liturgies and how we're shaped by kind of where we spend our time, right? Like everything is worship, pretty much. Like it's where you go, where you spend your time is forming you. It's forming your loves. It's forming your gods who you worship. And if you think about like a year like 2020, where people spent less time in church than ever, and more time online than ever before, it's just a numbers game. Like how can you, when you talk about formation, how can you compete? If you're a pastor, you have 2 hours a week to instill Christian formation into a Christian, and 70 hours a week. I don't know what the current numbers are, but we spend so many hours of our week online or on social media. And so it's an uphill battle, but man, it's important that we start thinking more carefully. Like I've been talking about digital discipleship as a phrase that I've used as like a priority for pastors going forward. Like media habits of our people need to be an agenda item. Like we need to know, not in like an Orwellian sense of like monitoring their every move on Google, but we need to know kind of what's shaping our people, because this is real. Like, look at what happened this week in Washington, D.C. There's a direct line of people being formed, being radicalized online to what happened at the Capitol. Like, so it's all connected to why I wrote this book. Like, there's dramatic things happening that are coming from how we're being shaped by our media habits, particularly in the internet space.
Great. So we've talked a bit about the information age, the digital age, but you didn't call the book the information pyramid, or right? Or even the discernment pyramid.
Yeah.
But the wisdom pyramid. So, what is wisdom?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, good question. I think in the book I talk about like the important distinction. I think the first line of the book I say something like, "There's more and more information than ever before, but less and less wisdom."
Okay.
So right there, I'm distinguishing. Wisdom is not information. Like, it's not, because we live in a world where we have more information at our fingertips than ever before. No human generation has had access to all accumulated knowledge of human civilization pretty much at their fingertips, literally. So that's not making us wise, though. So there's not a correlation between more information and more wisdom. And it's not the same thing as knowledge either. I think, there's a lot of brilliant people in the world who have several PhDs and who are absolute brainiacs, who have a ton of knowledge, who you wouldn't call wise. And so it's not information, it's not knowledge. I think what wisdom is, and I talk about various definitions of it in the book, but what it boils down to for me is it's the ability to know what to do with information. It's kind of like it's like a vitamin. Tozer compares it to a vitamin, and I have a quote in the book from him. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but he says something like, wisdom is like a vitamin in that it helps your body perform its functions better, so that it can turn nutrition. It can take what it needs to from nutrition and turn the waste away. So it's like a filter. It's like a healthy kidney. Yeah. Wisdom is like a healthy kidney. Yeah. It helps you filter through things, and so that you can take the good and the true and the beautiful and dispense with the false and the ugly. Okay. And that, more than anything, is what we need in today's world. In a world of information overload, what we desperately need is a better sense for what is true, and how we can know it when we see it, and how we can know falsehood when we see it. Yeah. And you can't do that without wisdom. So wisdom is this accumulated sense for truth, and for how to synthesize what you're taking in and kind of take the nutrients from it.
Okay. Which would be going beyond just mere discernment, right? Okay. Yeah. So I have all this information at my fingertips. This is good, this is bad. Yeah. But wisdom presses us beyond just being able to make that judgment.
Yes. Yeah. So it includes that judgment, I think. Yeah. Okay. But then it's, once you judge something to be, I think, worthwhile, it's then taking it and storing it in a way that is able to synthesize and to create health and flourishing. Okay. It's also wisdom is like a moral sense, right? It's not just the facts. It's what's right. It's knowing what's good, and sometimes it's knowing the best good out of a sea of goods, right? Mm-hmm. So wisdom is. I've been thinking about wisdom with like leaders during COVID, and how desperately our elected officials need wisdom. They have experts, all around them trying to get their ears, and they have PhDs and scientists and epidemiologists and data. They're swimming in data. But what wisdom is the ability to look at all of that, and a lot of it is good and true, and yet you have to be able. Sometimes you have to sacrifice one good for another good. Okay. And it's not always just as simple as this is good and this is evil. Sometimes as indecisions, we're faced with a number of goods, and wisdom, I think, is that accumulated sense for making decisions that can see the best good.
That's good. Yeah, one of the things as I was reading the Wisdom Pyramid, is just this sort of tension between, where do we find wisdom? And so the question I have out of that is wisdom something that's internal, that's ours, that we create or make, or is it something external that we have to go out and seek and to find?
Yeah. So I don't think it's something that you can just like go pluck, off of a tree sort of thing. Like it's not just.
That would be nice though.
It would.
Yeah. It would be nice. Yeah. It's, so in the book, like I had to be careful with my words because in each of the categories like that I talk about in the pyramid, like the Bible and nature, like they're all sources of truth. So I try not to, I was trying to be careful to not call them sources of wisdom, because I think that what they are is sources of truth, and wisdom is what exists with the accumulated truth that you glean from all these things. So yeah, I don't think wisdom is the same as kind of what you get from a book or any given beautiful thing or yeah. So and scripturally, I mean, wisdom is described as something from above, right? Like true wisdom is from above, and it's something you ask for. It is external to us, and we have to see it as something that ultimately originates from God, right? He is the standard of truth and wisdom, and He is wisdom incarnate. And so my wisdom pyramid, you'll notice, like it from the bottom up, it goes from like the closest proximity to God as wisdom incarnate to the least proximate to God. Yeah. And that's for a reason, because I believe that if we're going to find wisdom anywhere, if we're going to accumulate a life of wisdom anywhere, it has to be in reference and proximity to God.
Yeah. So maybe.
So did you just say that social media has the least proximity to God? Seriously?
I did.
Okay.
God's on social media.
I just want to make sure.
I think there's a Twitter.
There probably is. Yeah.
There's several Twitters.
And He's there, right? It's on the pyramid.
That's it.
Social media is on the pyramid still, people. I'm not saying it's not ever a source of wisdom.
Yeah. We'll get back to that. Would you say that wisdom is tied, or let me ask it a better way? Is wisdom connected to our wills?
Now you're getting philosophical
I'm sorry.
on me, Ryan.
I'm sorry. We don't have to do that.
That's right.
Is wisdom truth applied? Is that okay?
Yeah. I think that's one of the classic definitions of wisdom is the application of
putting
truth.
it into practice, living it.
Yeah, so there is an element of will then, I think.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Yeah.
It's like kind of like it's the intersection of kind of a moral impulse and things like conscience, right? God-given, the image of God that we bear, that is kind of like the conscience and the will, where that meets kind of external inputs. Yeah.
That's good.
In one of your earlier chapters, where you were still kind of introducing the topic, you made comment about how our culture is so unstable right now. The world is, right? And yet, if Christians are pursuing wisdom, how does that benefit the world? How does that bring stability to the world?
Yeah. I mean, I think that if Christians are to be light and salt in the world, and salt is a preservative, right? It kind of helps, it helps preserve things. Christians need to be the carriers of that light, in a darkening world. Where are people going to look if this epistemological crisis goes unchecked and it just keeps getting worse? And, people are just, all foundations crumble, all authorities crumble outside of the self, which it seems like we're already there in terms of the only authority left is the self. But I mean, the further this goes on, the more like desperate people are going to become for answers and for like something solid. And so where are they going to turn? Like that's why it's so important that Christians who have access to truth and wisdom and who have a paradigm for it need to lean into that and cultivate that in their life, because if we're not, if we just follow suit and we're kind of compromised like everyone else by this world, then what hope is there for the kind of lost souls in this, epistemologically crumbling place? Yeah.
Let's do this. Let's take a quick break. We'll talk about why we need wisdom and how we find wisdom, and then think about how we actually live in wisdom here shortly.
Hi, my name's Cole, and I'm an admissions counselor here at Western Seminary. One of the things I love about Western is its commitment to gospel transformation, helping students learn how to love God and neighbor better through rigorous and deeply thoughtful study of His Word. The admissions team is here to help you get the information you need to make a wise and confident decision about seminary, as well as walk you through the application process. To get in touch with us or find out more, go to westernseminary.edu. Now, back to the show.
Hey, welcome back, and we are here with Brett McCracken. We are talking about his book. A Portland area question that would come up. You write in your book against the idea of knowing and living your own truth in some idiosyncratic fashion, which would be kind of the mantra of the culture. Isn't your book just your truth?
Yeah. Good question, and I can see someone asking that in Portland. Yes, in some way it is, but I mean, the whole point of my book is really pointing people to other sources than me. And I say that early in the book, like in the introduction, I think I say, this is not about me, like as some sort of guru with my kind of prescription for wisdom. This is me pointing to sources that I found to be trustworthy, and ultimately to God and to the only solid sources of truth that are there. So that's probably how I would answer that. It's a book that's pointing beyond myself, and in general, I think that's what wisdom needs to do. If you want to be wise, you don't have to negate yourself, but you have to look beyond yourself. Looking only within yourself for your truth is a lonely place to be.
Yeah, and it's in many ways it's unattainable. I mean, because we're all shaped by our time, by our space.
Right.
And as you talk about these sources that we'll walk through here shortly, those are all informing us. Either we're choosing to be informed by them, or they're just coming to us just through our culture, through where we're living. So I think that's helpful. Even that idea of live your truth has an authoritative stance behind it that is not rooted in us. Someone's told us to do that.
Totally.
So having that sort of, there's even pushing on that, seeing that as a struggle. Like, okay, where did that come from? Kind of concept.
I mean, the whole concept falls apart on so many fronts all the time. But like, what happens when two people are living their truth and they totally conflict?
Yes.
I mean, that's the conflicts of our time, right? Yeah. It's the cake baker and the gay couple trying to live their truth, and they can't live peacefully together. So what happens then? Yeah. So we are permeable creatures. Like we can't live in isolation. We're all embedded within each other's, influenced by each other, influencing each other. And so it's just fallacious to think that we can live in this kind of autonomous bubble of self-definition.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for us to just see that and bring that to the level of we need to discuss this and see what's influencing us and where wisdom really, really is. Yeah, that's good. So let's jump into the book itself. And so you break this up into two sort of major categories. What are those? I mean, the way you think about these sources that you talk about.
Yeah, so the first half of the book is called The Sources of Our Sickness. So it's really me laying out the landscape and the problems that we're seeing and why we are kind of culturally sick. And then the second half of the book is the sources of our wisdom. So really going through the wisdom pyramid paradigm as one suggestion for how we can become healthier. Yeah, the first half of the book, Sources of Our Sickness, it's 3 chapters, and each chapter is like one kind of symptom or iteration dynamic in our culture that is causing us to be sick. So those 3 in brief are too much information, too fast information, so the speed, and then too focused on me. So the first problem is gluttony. So if we're going to use kind of the food metaphor, kind of extending that metaphor, just like eating too much food makes you physically sick, too much information makes us sick for so many reasons. You go down a buffet line and you take a little bit of everything, you're going to get sick. And so if that's how we're approaching information in the wildly expansive information age, just kind of uncritically consuming everything, we can't help but get sick from that. So the second problem, too much or too fast, the speed problem, it also has a corollary to eating, right? If you eat fast food, oftentimes it doesn't end well for your stomach. If you're rushing to
he's right, exactly right. Taco Bell.
If you just eat good food but in a fast pace, it can create problems. So the same is true of information. Like the pace of things in the information age is so prone to problems, whether it's our susceptibility to fake news and kind of unvetted stories going viral and catching on, and sometimes we even perpetuate them by retweeting it before we've investigated it. Like that is a problem for our wisdom. And just the speed with which we can post things, like, man, we get into so much trouble with that, right?
It's terrifying, isn't it?
It's so terrifying. So the speed is a problem. And then the third one is the too focused on me, the kind of orientation of information around the individual. And the corollary there with food is like, you're not going to be healthy if you only ever eat just your favorite foods, like the things that you like. Like, I love chocolate chip cookies, but if my diet only consisted of chocolate chip cookies, I would get sick, right? So we need a balanced diet. We need to eat beyond our favorite foods. And we also just can't rely on our gut instincts as to what's healthy. Right. So if I'm kind of going on a walk in a forest and I look at a mushroom and I'm like, that looks good, it looks edible, and I pick it up to eat it, I could die, right? Like it could literally be my gut instinct leading me to death. Right. That's why the FDA exists. That's why like food nutrition labels exist, because you need expertise outside of the consumer to regulate this stuff. So that's the same with information. We can't just look within ourselves. Like that's going to be a disaster. Not that we never can, or that there's nothing to be found within. As Christians, we believe in conscience and kind of the image of God and common grace and whatnot. But the philosophy of today, which is kind of everything is about the self and looking within, we're seeing the fruit of that, and it's bad. It's sickness.
And my judgments on things aren't necessarily absolute, and I don't have the power to make something right or wrong, good or bad. Right.
Yeah. We can't just be the arbiters of all judgments. No.
If we could just drill down, so that's a really helpful summary of that section. Just want to drill down on a few ideas that you bring out. Could you tell us what infotainment is? Am I saying that right? Infotainment, and what the problem is with it?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a Neil Postman. I don't know if he coined that term, but it's basically what he wrote about with amusing ourselves to death. Yeah. And it's just the idea that, like, in the information age, in the way that it's all coming at us in fragmented chunks of, and literally with our feeds, right? It's horrifying images of people storming the Capitol in Washington, D.C., right next to a sports score or a cat video or, someone's baby photo of their cute kid. Like, so we're living our worlds through this very haphazard feed of reality that is information, it's news, and it's entertainment, and it's sometimes hard to discern the differences between any of it. And it's all kind of been flattened on this one layer of media that is coming at us. And so what Postman was so prophetic about was, I mean, he was writing about this in the 80s, and where he was coming from was the evening news, back in those old days where we all watched like one evening news broadcast, and that was pretty much it. He even saw the problem there in terms of what he called the now ... this problem. So it would be like a story about some horrifying homicide, and then it would be now this, and it would go to the sports guy, and he would talk about sports, and now this, and then it would be some fluff piece about someone's lost puppy being found. And what Postman was getting at was like, if this is our experience of the world, it trivializes everything, right? When you have everything kind of the serious and the trivial on the same plane, we start to become desensitized. And we start to see everything through that lens, such that...
To both the good and the bad.
To both the good and the bad. And so you can start to look at car chases and O.J. Simpson trials as entertainment.
Right.
And we have, right? It's high rating. CNN had its highest rated day ever on Wednesday of this week with the storming of the Capitol. And that's not to say it wasn't newsworthy, but it was good TV. It was like watching a movie.
Yeah.
And
how the 24-hour news cast is pushing that idea too.
Totally.
How do we fill this 24 hours?
Yeah.
And get you into that space?
Oh man, we could talk forever about just what the 24-hour news has done, because let's be honest, there's not enough news in the world to fill that time. So what happens is the definition of news changes, and I've just been thinking a lot about the history of the phrase breaking news, and someone needs to write a book about that, because I grew up in a world in the 80s and 90s where breaking news, quote unquote, was relatively rare. Like I can remember a few times, maybe a handful of things, like the Oklahoma City bombing or the Waco thing or the Gulf War or whatever. Now my kids are growing up in a world where breaking news happens literally every minute. You turn on the news, you're liable to see breaking news on the screen. You open up Twitter, something is breaking. Yeah. And so what does that do to us? Like, how do we start to see the world? How are we shaped in a world where breaking news is no longer an exception, but it's the norm?
Okay.
So social media, though, it's, I mean, the very name itself, doesn't it make us more social?
Well, I think that in some ways maybe it does, and I think that I mean, I've had examples of making real connections on social media, so I'm not someone who wants to write it all off, but I think that the statistics and the studies that have been coming out in recent years are hard to argue with in terms of like we're lonelier than ever as a culture, we're more depressed, we're more mental illness is on the rise, so something about the faux social nature of social media, the illusion, the perception of sociality that we get with social media isn't working for us as humans. I think that, we're less known in that way that humans long and need to be known than ever before, because we posture on social media and there's layers of barriers between the real and what we put out there. And so I don't know that social media is helping us socially as much as Silicon Valley would like, and actually Silicon Valley knows it. I think they're in a bind right now because they're seeing the social fabric of the world disintegrating on their account. and now they're trying to pick up the pieces and regulate it and self-regulate it in a way
Self-regulate, or at least notify us about it.
or notify us. Yeah, try to ping us when something isn't helpful. But the whole structure is problematic, and so it'll be interesting to see the long-term future of social media.
So this idea comes outside of this section. It's actually at the end of your book. You talk about wisdom as liberation. And wisdom as liberation. As I read the book, I sort of shot me back to the beginning and the sources of our sickness, liberating us from these sources of sickness, in a sense. And in that discussion of wisdom as liberation, you talk about a freedom from and a freedom to. Could you help us understand what you mean by wisdom as liberation, especially in the context of that freedom from and freedom to?
Yeah. I mean, I think the popular conception of liberation today, or freedom today, is the freedom from, right? It's whatever the oppressor is, whatever's stifling us and keeping us from becoming our true self or expressing our true self. Like, that's what we're trying to fight against. That's what the freedom fight is all about. But classically, if you think about what freedom is, it's a more positive construction. It's you're free to do what. So it goes back to what we were saying earlier about just the kind of anti-culture, deconstructive orientation of culture. It's tied to that. Like we've lost the ability to think constructively. So what do we do with freedom? And so the liberating aspect of wisdom is freedom, because it makes us less chained to the manipulations of the zeitgeist, whatever those are. It allows us to have a certain degree of just kind of free agency in a world of that wants to clump us into one camp or the other, and it is kind of sorting, right? Like there's this sorting going on based on various ideologies. Wisdom lets you be free from that, and it lets you look at everything from multiple angles, and to be able to look at any given thing, whether a book or an article or a thinker, and to take what's good and critique what's bad. And that's freedom, is being able to, in the face of all these potentially problematic things that want to commandeer your mind and your heart, to be able to withstand that and maintain a certain degree of critical distance while also gaining what can be gleaned from it.
Well, if I could just say this, I mean, about the book, I think one of the best things that you're doing, and you're doing a lot of really, really good things here. One of the best things is you are showing us how to live this liberation, to be free, to engage these different layers,
right,
where we find wisdom.
Right.
So we're free to engage Scripture. We're free to couple ourselves to Scripture, right? To be towards it, to be with it. And that walks through, the way we think about church, nature, and these, all the layers that you're doing, even the concept of social media that you do at the end. I think it's really, really helpful, because it gives you the freedom to sort of, as you're talking about, look from different angles and to find truth and ways to live and practice that truth.
Right.
So I think that's really, really helpful. That idea of liberation, wisdom connected to liberation, and then making sure that we understand that liberation towards something is really, really helpful here, especially as it's played out in this book. So let's jump into that next section, because we're going from sources of sickness to sources of wisdom, and let's talk about. So you lay out 6 levels. That's an okay word to use. Levels of the wisdom pyramid.
Levels,
Okay. Could you just maybe briefly just walk us through what those levels are?
Yeah. So the base layer, which I think we've mentioned a couple times, is the Bible. So for Christians, that should be a no-brainer. I think if we're thinking about the foundation of truth, this is God's direct revelation to us. It's His very speech to us. And if we believe God is the source and the embodiment of wisdom, eternal wisdom, then his, what a gift that he's actually like spoken and put it in words. So that has to occupy the foundation. And to speak to the wisdom as liberation idea, like part of the trajectory of the wisdom pyramid from the bottom up is that the more grounded you are in the bottom layers, the more freedom you have to explore the upper layers. Yeah. So the upper levels might be a little more fraught with potential dangers because they're not as directly proximate to God, so therefore they're more fallible. There's more potential for error. But if you're grounded solidly in those bottom layers, like Scripture and the local church, it in theory it should give you that wisdom that is freeing, that gives you the freeing discernment to be able to navigate those other layers in a way that's healthy. If you go into those upper layers without the bottom layers, I think you're asking for trouble. Yeah. And so that's one of the reasons why it's structured the way that it is. So yeah, the Bible is the foundation. Then I have the church. Kind of going with that idea of like the most proximate to God. And you can make arguments, I guess, with nature. We'll get to that. But like the church is God's living kind of bride, right? It's the bride of Christ. It's the presence of God and his people, we believe, in the church. So in a sense, it is, we're close to God in the church, and it's his people. Yeah. It's the family of God. And there's all sorts of language in the New Testament that describes us as the body, and Christ is the head. So there's this union with wisdom incarnate in the church. Not to say the church is infallible, and this is where my book is quite Protestant versus Catholic. Yeah. I think a Catholic version of the wisdom pyramid might have the church and the Bible on the joining on the foundational layer, but I have the church one level up because there is, we believe that, the church is fallible people, so therefore there can be error, and there is error, and certainly the church today is full of problems. But there's also so many aspects of the church that if we commit to it and really prioritize it in our rhythms of life, it can be such a boon to our wisdom. And yeah.
So a question I think that will come up throughout on each of these is, are these different sources of wisdom, or what wisdom do you get from the church that you don't get from Scripture?
Yeah. Yes. So it's it's a good question, and I think in most of the chapters I try to like preempt that question by I think sometimes I even say like, well, why do we need this if we have Scripture? Yeah. And I think that the Scripture functions as a nice kind of again, like I said, it provides the freeing foundation to glean wisdom from these other more fallible sources. And it acts as like a check and balance against it. So if you have any question about something that's happening in the church that you're not quite sure is wise or true, then Scripture is the ultimate trump card as to whether we can see it as wise. The local church is like the church historically, though, in terms of its relationship to Scripture, is an interpretive community. Okay. So if we want to glean wisdom from Scripture, we need arguably we need the church. You can get wisdom and truth from Bible without it. Like if you're on a desert island somewhere, theoretically, and you only have the Bible, great. But God gives us the church for a purpose and for a reason, and one of those I think is to help us to help be guardrails with Scripture and to know what to do with it and how to apply it in life. So kind of the church and the Bible as categories are really related in that sense. But yeah, and to answer your question just about what way, how do they function as wisdom, I would say they're sources of truth and kind of habits of wise living, maybe. So it's both about what you get from it in terms of truth, but also how it forms you. So in the church chapter, I talk a lot about habits and the rituals of the church and how that it's not just a matter of depositing good biblical preaching into your mind. That's one aspect of how the church gives us wisdom, but it's also about the bodily rhythms of worshiping together corporately week after week, and taking communion and practicing the sacraments and the church calendar. Like all of these aspects of the church shape us in the direction of wisdom. So
That's good.
yeah.
Tell us, so we've gone through a couple of these. I want to keep us on sort of walking through these levels. You have you have Bible, then the next one is the church, and then you have nature.
Yeah.
So what are you trying to do in that chapter?
Yeah, that was a really fun one to write as a lover of nature and the outdoors. I put it where it is in the pyramid because it's God's creation, so it's proximate to God in that sense. It's what He made, and Augustine and others talked about creation as like the second book.
Right. Calvin's there, yeah.
Calvin and so there's a tradition in Christian history of viewing kind of general revelation and special revelation as two kind of sources that we can avail ourselves of in terms of truth. And the Bible itself points us in that direction, right? Like Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Right. Romans 1, Paul talks about how we're without excuse because of what was made. Yeah. If you just look at the world God made, there's things about Him that you should know.
Yeah. There's truth.
There's truth there.
That people do know.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I talk about in the nature chapter. Is there's so much truth in God's creation that can help us become wise if we have ears to hear and eyes to see and fingers to touch. And that's the beautiful thing about nature, is it's so multisensory. Yeah. And it's not, again, like this is a big theme about the book throughout, but wisdom is not just a cerebral thing. We can't think of it as only like ideas that we put in our heads from various sources. It's a full-bodied part of existence, right? It comes through different ways.
Yeah.
So
you talk about the body.
The body,
chapter specifically.
Right. Yeah. Where the way God set up the body, there's so much wisdom. There's so much truth that we can glean by thinking about that. Like I write about sleep in the book, and like if you just sit there and ponder sleep for a while, like there's so much theology there. There's so much truth there. God didn't have to set up the world that way.
Yeah.
He didn't. He really didn't. Like, but why did He? Why did He make it so that humans had to sleep in order to survive and function? Why did He make it so that we had to eat, like, in order to survive? He didn't have to. Theoretically, He could have created a world where we, just didn't,
Sure.
So all of these things...
We're empowered by the sun, like Superman or something, right?
Yes.
Someone needs to do that science fiction story,
It's always superheroes with you. Yeah.
I try.
So, just
quickly.
Now, I will say this. I would say most Christians writing this book would probably stop there. But you go on, and you talk about books and beauty and social media.
Okay.
So why books, beauty, and social media?
Okay, I'll try to be quick with these, but there's so much I could say. Books, books, it's kind of like an obvious one when you're thinking about wisdom, like read books. But I was thinking there with just regard to what a book does differently than like a tweet or an article online even. It's about training us how to think. So the wisdom that books offer it can be about the substance of any given book, and it often is, but more than anything, it's about what books do in terms of how we think well and how we can kind of develop skills of critical thinking to engage with one idea over a longer period of time, and to sit with one person's perspective, one author's perspective for a long period of time. Like that alone is, there's so much wisdom we can glean from that, and it's hard to come by in a world where we go from like soundbite to soundbite and tweet to tweet, and we never have a big context to anything, and we read the worst things into things that we see, and we think the worst of the author. So I'd rather read a book by someone I just disagree with than read a Twitter thread, because at least with a book I can truly give them my attention in a good faith way for a while. And at the end of the day, I might disagree with 80% of it, but maybe there's 20% of it that I didn't know and that helps me. And so I talk about reading diversely and how valuable that is in terms of getting outside of your kind of narrow perspectives and how freeing. It goes back to the wisdom is liberation. I mean, I think so many people in history who had lives that were more or less restricted, whether it was just by virtue of where they grew up or maybe they were even like in prison or something. They talk about books that way. Books are freedom. It's your escape. It's the way out, right? You can it's like our closest thing to time travel. It's our closest thing to travel. In the pandemic, like reading books is, next best thing to going somewhere.
What about beauty?
What about beauty?
Yeah.
There's a lot about beauty.
Yes, there is. There's a whole chapter.
There's a whole chapter. There could be a whole book. I mean, beauty. So I said earlier, the thing about wisdom is that it's not just about the cerebral, and it's not just about facts coming into your brain. Beauty speaks to the other layers of existence, the affective, not just the cerebral, our heart and our loves and our emotions. And that's what beauty, that's the level at which beauty often functions. It's why poetry can kind of communicate something true in a way that a PowerPoint presentation with the same content couldn't. It's why a Beethoven symphony, which may not even have words, can convey something about existence that nothing else can, right? There's a unique and mysterious level at which beauty functions for our wisdom. And the Bible agrees that beauty is important, right? Jesus speaks, he didn't just speak in theorems and kind of syllogisms. He spoke in parables, right? He told stories. He used vivid language and metaphors. The Bible itself is not just prose, it's poetry, it's story. There's villains and heroes. And so, if the Bible is our chief source of wisdom, it itself is an example of why beauty is important for our wisdom. Because God could have revealed himself to us through a cosmic PowerPoint presentation that he downloaded into our brains.
Sounds just fantastic.
So good.
Right? It would be easier probably if
Everything propositional.
If we all just had a bullet point list of everything we needed to know about God, then it would be easier. But God, in his infinite wisdom, thought it would be better to send us a book, a collection of books, right? A narrative that is sometimes hard to read, which every good story, every good literature, every good poem especially is super hard to dissect. But it's worth it because there's types of wisdom and types of truth that you can't get any other way.
And it's not the task of the exegete to distill theological truth necessarily, because genres do different things. Yeah. Right. So even though like in poetry there is fantastic theological truth, it's not merely that.
It's not merely that. Yeah. And I think Protestants can get better at understanding that because we're so prone to want that, like, what's the takeaway? What's the what's the core nugget? And while that's important, there's an inefficiency to beauty and kind of a roundabout way that beauty operates. And Jesus's parables are the perfect example. Like, they're so cryptic, right? They're so, couldn't he have been clearer? People who heard them said that, literally. Like, what are you trying to say? Why couldn't you say it more clearly? But he chose not to for a reason. And I think that, it's important to reckon with that.
In my hermeneutics classes, I talk about this very thing, and I say, take Psalm 23. There's great theological truth in that. God is provider, God is protector, God is nurturer. But you'd never stand up at a funeral and just say, hey, God is protector. Right. God is provider. Totally. No, we want to read and hear Psalm 23.
Right. Yeah. That's why hymns and singing have been part of Christian liturgy since pretty much day one, right? Because there's something about the beauty of that form that is significant in its own right. Yeah. Okay, so the last one is the internet and social media.
Finally.
We've reached the top.
That's like the dessert, right?
We've reached the summit. It's like the dessert. It's like, but yeah, I mean, it's somehow not as satisfying as dessert a lot of times, but equally bad for our health. So what to say? I mean, I will say that it's on the pyramid. So I do think that there are ways in which the online world and social media can be a place where we find truth and can be valuable for our wisdom. And I think that to say otherwise would be to basically be, how would we live in this world if we, for better or worse, we live in a digital world. This is our existence. So we have to believe that there can be a way to live in this space that is helpful and healthy and productive for our wisdom. So that chapter I talk about like a couple specific ways that I think the internet and social media are helpful for our wisdom. And then I offer us like some tips for how we can navigate it in a careful, discerning way. So I won't go through each of them, but that's the gist of that.
But I think they're very helpful, and it's almost worth the price of the book there. Yeah.
Let me ask what's one sort of closing question here, especially for the pastors in our audience. I mean, how should pastors and church members view and engage social media, this glut of information, and how should pastors, and you mentioned this earlier, how do pastors pastor people in their digital lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, I think digital discipleship, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be like one of the big pressing priority areas for pastoral ministry in the next decade, or longer. And what that looks like, I think it's so early as like an area of priority for pastors. And my book is just one kind of entry in that genre of trying to help people, but particularly pastors. I wrote this book for leaders and pastors and parents to be able to help disciple those under them, recognizing the importance of everything that we're formed by, and we're, like I said, we're permeable creatures, always being formed by what comes into us, so we need to be mindful of what's coming into us, and how can we prioritize things that are healthy while we live in this world with so much unhealth all around us.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Brett. We really appreciate you joining us here.
Absolutely.
We also hope to be giving away a free copy of this. We'll hopefully get some information out to you through our social media channels. Our apologies for that. We'll use your wisdom pyramid to get there. Thanks again, Brett. We loved having you here.